Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the latest in the Poverty Alliance's series of webinars. My name is Peter Kelly. I'm Director of the Poverty Alliance. This webinar tonight is a little bit different from some of the ones that we've held in the past. It's also part of Challenge Poverty Week, which I'll say a little bit more about in a second. But just to let you know, we're recording the webinar and we will post the film, the video of it, afterwards on the Poverty Alliance website. And I would encourage you, we'll have some time for questions to our two speakers tonight later on in our discussion. So I would encourage you to use the Q&A function, not the chat function, but the Q&A function, and we'll try and gather as many of your questions and put them to Mary and Nat later on. So just by way of introduction, before I introduce both Mary and Nat, and to give you an idea of why we're running this discussion tonight and why we think this issue is so important. So we started doing Challenge Poverty Week back in 2013. And the focus of Challenge Poverty Week since the start has always been on a focus on solutions to poverty, but also as a focus on the narrative and the need to change the way we talk about the narrative around poverty. We knew that if we really wanted to change policy, if we really wanted to address poverty and lift people out of poverty or prevent people going into poverty, we also needed to change people's minds. But it was also more than that. Our focus and our concern about stigma, about shame, and about the narrative around poverty wasn't just about how do we change policy, how do we do this just to change policy. It was also, we knew from talking to people who live on low incomes that there is a material and psychological impact of stigmatizing and shaming narratives around poverty. So for all those reasons, Challenge Poverty and a range of other activities that the Poverty Alliance undertake have focused on trying to address shame, address stigma, and address how we change the narrative on poverty. So I am extremely pleased, it would be fair to say, that we've got two tremendous speakers for us tonight, experts in this area, people who have written a lot about these issues, thought a lot about these issues, but also, I think quite crucially, have taken action around them as well, who have demonstrated what we need to do to try and change the narrative around poverty. So let me just, before I start asking questions, and the format for tonight's webinar is very much a Q&A. You're not going to get PowerPoint presentations. We're going to have a chat with Mary and Nat this evening about their work around this area. So Mary, as I'm sure many of you will know, is a journalist and an author. She's written extensively for The Guardian for a long time, but has been freelance and done a whole range of other activities and producing and working in other areas over the last 10 years, over the last 20 years. And some of her books, Austerity Bites, which I'm sure many of you know, and The Shame Game, which came out earlier this year and will be the subject or a big part of what we talk about tonight. But Mary's not just a writer. She's also founded Project Twisted, which again we'll talk about no doubt a bit tonight. And I would encourage you to have a look at some of the outputs from Project Twisted as well. Really fascinating work and impactful work around storytelling to change how we talk about poverty. Nat Kendall-Taylor, again, some of you will undoubtedly be familiar with Nat's work. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Frameworks Institute, based in Washington, DC. He's an expert, and I did write this down, in psychological anthropology and communications, and Nat will no doubt explain to us what that actually means later on. He's been with Frameworks since 2008 and has worked around the world, I would say, on using this approach to communications and to changing frameworks in a whole range of areas, not just on issues to do with poverty, but to do with early childhood development, mental health, ageing, as well as on poverty. So that's the introductions out of the way. Those were hopefully brief enough, and let us get into some of the discussion. So I'm going to start with you, Mary. So I'd mentioned the book Austerity Bites that came out in 2014, and that was a book about the impact of austerity in the UK, very much talking to people who were at the sharp end of that impact of austerity. And I was interested to know how from that book you got to writing a book about shame and about the narrative around poverty. What was the connection there? What was the motivation, if you like?
Well, hello everybody, first of all. I'm thrilled to be here. Well, it fascinated me when I first started doing the work that led to that book, because it was 2012 when I started traveling around the UK, and it was just after that sort of limbo period when we knew that austerity was on the way, but its full force hadn't been felt yet. In the lead up to these policies coming through, everything from the bedroom tax to benefits caps, etc., the coalition government had been very, very shrewd in the way they messaged it. The way they sold austerity to the British public was a lesson in how to weaponize a narrative. When I was going around the country, people kept, like just out of the blue, unprompted, repeating back lines that the government and various different ministers and pundits had been using ad nauseum. You know, in the context of the economic crisis, we've all got to tighten our belts. The credit card is maxed out. You know, things that really don't make any sense. But I mean, Nat will talk about this, but actually have a real tug on people. It's said and done in a way that people can digest. You know, I'm always very conscious that people who are into politics or follow quite closely have to appreciate that, you know, most people, that's not their life. They're getting on with their life. So the messages that manage to penetrate have to be very effective to do it. Now, it struck me that if you're trying to sell something as catastrophic as austerity and you're managing to do it and sell it to the very people that it's going to harm, then something's going on. I started sort of thinking about this more and more, the more people I spoke to, and realized that actually what this austerity narrative was a sort of micro version of a bigger poverty narrative that had been drummed home for decades in Britain, and that had a lot to do with terms like personal responsibility, you know, things that basically individualized social problems of all kinds. I mean, even going back to New Labour, you know, things like tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, you know, all of these mantras that had been wheeled out by all kinds of governments, you know, not just the Tories. And so I wanted to look at it a bit more, and I wanted to find out why it was so effective, why it was so powerful. Because frankly, it wouldn't be being used if it wasn't effective. And the next question became not just why is this working so well, but why is there not an alternative to it? Why don't we have something as effective? What is it about it that means that it sticks? So the Shame Game came out of that. I had launched Project Twisted, where I was again back out, except this time in the US as well as the UK, talking to people, specifically people with lived experience of poverty, about what it feels like to live in poverty and what the impact is of these narratives. And because the more you talk to people, the more you realize that the lack of material things is only one part of what it is to experience poverty. So that's how the two ended up stitching together. And I felt like this was just too powerful a thing to not be dissected, especially at a time like this.
Yeah, I think that's something that maybe we'll come back to later as well, Mary, and discuss with Nat too, is that sense of which the way that we talk about poverty has become much more important. And for those of us who are trying to address poverty, it's not about what are the specific policies that we need to enact to bring about material change, but there is something much wider now. That I think we've always known. I mean, I remember the early days of New Labour when we were talking of rights and responsibilities, and many of us would have challenged that kind of language. But I think now there seems to be a much greater sense amongst those of us that are concerned about poverty to really challenge that language in a much more consistent way and using new kinds of techniques. And I guess maybe just before I go to Nat, one of the things that really struck me about the book, and I know that we'll talk about this later as well, but the way that you've woven into that book your personal experience as well, and the importance of that. And I think that's something that we all have to learn. But I don't know if there was maybe something that you wanted to say about that. Some of the most affecting parts of the book, were the most powerful parts of that book, were about your explanations for your experience and how that felt.
Yeah, I was, I mean, I don't tend to write about my personal experience. As a journalist, you're more interested in talking to other people about theirs. That's just what it's all about. But I felt that for this, and especially when I was putting Project Twisted together, that I had to talk about my own lived experience of this, particularly in the context of shame, which is what I was focused on a lot in this, because I grew up in poverty. So as a child and adolescent, that was my reality. And to me personally, a huge part of that reality was feeling stigmatized, was feeling shamed, was feeling othered, was watching the news and knowing that people like us were being talked about as if, basically as if we were garbage, you know, as if we were leeches on society. But also because of my experience of the systems and structures around me that helped me. So it made me very, very aware that yes, the culture vilifies you, but if there are systems in place, including a good education system, free healthcare, that, you know, that can make it, that really does make a difference in your life. These things help you do all the things that you might want to do. And I just felt like, well, why don't we talk about that? Why don't we talk about the things that actually make people's lives better and don't keep people down, but actually give us a leg up, do you know what I mean? And not in an individualized sense of it. But the humiliation that comes with being poor is sort of, it's so multifaceted and it never really gets talked about enough. You're just supposed to, you know, shoulder it. Either you've got a chip on your shoulder if you talk about it, or you're whining, you know. And then similarly for someone like myself who, you know, technically, you know, I'm the person that you could go, oh, look at you, you know, you got out of poverty, so why can't everybody do it? And I want to be able to say, you know what, nobody knows how many hurdles you jump over just to exist every day in that sort of need. So that journey, I felt, has to be better understood, and not in terms of the personal narrative of, you know, look at me, I'm great, I've made it, etc. But until you actually understand the experience, you don't understand the issue. And I think the only way we can do that is with stories, like, you know, from the people who have experienced it, and then put that in the context of the wider understanding of all the things that are at play, including the narrative that enables impoverishment, because that's what it does.
Yeah, great, thank you. So just that's probably a good point to turn to Nat and think about how issues of the narrative have gone up the agenda for particularly NGOs, campaigners over the last 10, 15 years. Maybe, Nat, just to open up, if you could maybe tell us a wee bit about the work that the Frameworks Institute does and what it is you're trying to do through this process of reframing.
Sure, thank you, Peter, and nice to see you. We haven't seen each other in person for a while. It'd be great to actually be able to do this in the same room, but this will substitute for now, and it's great to be here with you all. And thanks for having me, Peter, and thank you for everybody who's spending the time with us, I guess this evening for you, this afternoon for me. So I'll start with that kind of provocative jab at my professional identity as an anthropologist, and I'll kind of tell you what the heck that means. So I do a kind of anthropology, as you correctly noted, Peter, which is called psychological anthropology, which basically means that I'm fixated, I'm fascinated by the way that culture influences how people think, specifically how culture, and kind of culture in mind, not kind of Indiana Jones archaeology kind of culture, but culture as a way we think, influences the way we process information, we make meaning of messages, and we formulate and reach decisions. And one of those decisions is about how we construct our own identity, which is a lot of what Mary's work touches on. And I do that work at the Frameworks Institute with about 30 other social scientists of various disciplines, not luckily for the world, not all of whom are anthropologists, but people who are sociologists and linguists and political scientists. And we're really interested in two things. We're interested in how people think about social issues like poverty or homelessness or early childhood or climate change or addiction or health equity, whatever it may be, not at a kind of surface level that we're used to hearing about how people answer a couple poorly framed questions on a public opinion survey, but really deeply how it is that we've developed consistent and persistent ways of understanding the world and the people in it, and how we bring those ways of understanding the world to think about social issues. And Mary's already kind of been talking at that level of deep understandings, right? If we understand the success in the world to be a complete and narrow function of effort and drive, and that's what it means to be a good person. If you haven't succeeded financially, what does that mean, right? You back up that proposition and it basically means you're a failure, you're immoral, and hearing these things over and over and over and over again in the information air that we breathe every day is what creates stigma. I mean, to make a really complicated thing artificially simple. So understanding how people think about issues is key for us to be able to position our messages effectively. Right? If we know that kind of bootstraps individualism is there, we know that we shouldn't inadvertently trip and fall into it, or else none of our other points about systems or structures or all these other things that we as advocates want to talk about can be heard. And then the second thing that we do is we study framing. We study how the choices that you make and how you present information, sometimes these are really in your face obvious things. Do you use the value of compassion, or do you use the value of kind of instrumental return on investment? How those choices, both big and small, influence what people think, how they feel, and what they do as a result of hearing your information. And that's really the kind of core of framing, is this way in which it's not just what we have to say, in this case about poverty, right? Peter, you are an expert on anti-poverty, right? You know a lot of factual things about this issue and how it works and what causes it and what we should do to address it. I'm not gonna stand here or sit here and say that doesn't matter. But the idea of framing is that that's not all that matters, right? What also matters is if any of that content knowledge that you have is actually gonna have an effect on the world and the people in it and the problems we are dealing with, you have to attend to this little other thing, which is how you say what you have to say. And those choices in how you say what you have to say can be the difference between whether your information kind of cuts through and moves people's thinking and opens up new ways for people to think about issues, and whether it gets swallowed up, whether it closes down people's thinking, whether it actually backfires and strengthens some of those understandings which are impeding your ability to connect with people. And I realize I'm probably talking too long, but I guess just one more thing to kind of connect with your question, which I haven't really answered yet, but I've talked for a while, is this idea that people have been thinking about framing for a long time, and narrative is kind of a part of framing, right? How you package and how you present information in terms of an overarching narrative. And we can talk later about what this now ubiquitous and overused term of narrative actually means, which is something we should do. Long paid attention to, and I think over the last probably 5 or 10 years has become really poignant and pertinent as we are seeing again and again and again that the choices and how we present information are not just kind of pretty prose on the kind of outskirts of our issues, but are central to our mission, to our ability to be effective advocates. And I think you have never seen that more powerfully than in the last 7 months, right? Where we've got frames around vulnerability. And I would argue that vulnerability frames are a key dimension of the stigma and stereotype that Mary talks about. I mean, think about being in a group that is continually labeled vulnerable. Like, what does that do, right? That's consequential. It's consequential in terms of how the rest of society sees you, and it's incredibly consequential in terms of how you see yourself. And so I think that when we are in these periods of social flux, the way that we position information is even more powerful and consequential than it is in moments that are less poignantly or less powerfully in flux. So the way that we, I mean, to be a little dramatic, the way that we are framing our issues right now, it matters now, but it is also shaping understandings in a way that are going to matter coming out of this for the next 10 to 20 years. And so this conversation that we're having right now, I feel, and granted I'm biased because this is what I do, but it feels incredibly important, and not just for what is directly in front of us, but what we will be moving into in terms of how people think about our issues going forward.
Thank you, Matt. I think you answered my opening question and a few others besides there as well. So that's good. That's value. But I think one of the things that you said was we need to talk about what the narrative is, and I want to do that now. But one of the things that you did say that struck with me there was facts matter, but that's not all that matters. And I think as someone who's been doing this kind of work, involved in campaigning for social change for 25, 30 years, I came from a very traditional approach that was, if we repeat the facts often enough, and if we just tell it more loudly, if we say it more loudly, say it with more vigor, and demand much more, then eventually we'll win out. And I think that's, I think we know that that's not the case. We know that that's not the case at all. So for me, that's one of the reasons why, as advocates, we need to understand this area of work. We need to understand better how to position and how to use the language that that we want to. But going back to that question that you had there for us, Nat, about what is the overused word narrative? This is a question to both of you, maybe come to you first, Mary, but what is from your work, Mary, what's the dominant narrative around poverty at the moment?
I think we've touched on it in all kinds of ways already. But I think one of the people that I interviewed for the book and for other things, Chuck Collins, who wrote a book called Born on Third Base. He was born into a wealthy family, etc. I thought he gives the best kind of distillation I've ever heard, which is just that according to this, you're economically where you deserve to be. So that plants it very firmly on the head of the individual. I also like the way he distilled it because it is as straightforward and as simple and as comprehensible as any of the other messages that come from the other direction. I think ultimately that is what it is. And you're putting a bit of flesh on the bones of that. It basically means that you as an individual are entirely responsible for the outcomes of your life, that if it's not a good outcome according to the value system that we decide a good outcome is, then you are a flawed individual or you've made bad life decisions. But there's a corollary to that as well. It's like two sides of a coin, because the other side of that coin is that if you are successful by society's conventional idea of what success means, then that's entirely up to you and your smartness and your grit and your determination, and there's a kind of strange heroicism involved in it. And what all of that does, I think, is package it in terms of so-called aspiration. But the terms of that aspiration are entirely dictated by the economic situation that we're in. So if you happen to be a totally fantastic carer, who looks after people in your community, but that is not deemed to be success, then technically you're not successful. So whole swathes of people can get caught by this trap, I think. But that, for me, is what it boils down to. But I know that there are better sort of social scientific and sociological ways of putting it, I think. But that's ultimately it. It's not, you know, on the surface, it's effective because it's not very complicated.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And you know, thinking about the way that inequality, not just poverty, but inequality is rationalized and justified now, I think that narrative around the idea that if you end up at the top, then you're there because of something that you did, of your own efforts, and therefore the opposite of that is that then if you're not at the top, then that's your own responsibility too. Nat, what would you say? How would you talk about the narrative of poverty, and particularly given the work that you've done in the UK for Joseph Rowntree Foundation around talking about poverty that looked at the narrative? How would you describe it in the UK at least?
Yeah, I'll do you, I don't know if it's one better or one worse, but I'll talk a little bit about the US and a little bit about the UK, because we're actually engaged in a project right now in the US that's trying to answer that specific question. So first of all, I think the way that we're talking about narrative so far is entirely consistent with the way that I think about it, right? It is a simplified, rarefied, meta pattern of understanding that can be activated through a bunch of different stories and mechanisms and images and aphorisms and metaphors and whatever, right? And I think that what Mary laid out as a narrative, this is one of the rare chances that I get to say, is actually a narrative. Like, that is a narrative. That's what we're talking about here. But narratives are not stories, right? A narrative is not the individual weaving of a bootstraps narrative. So I think that's important to say. The other important dimension of this, which you all talked about, is kind of, Peter used the word justify, and I'd be a little bit probably more sociological in that, and I talk about power, right? That narratives have this function of legitimizing certain structures of power and of delegitimizing agency and other identities. And I think that is a lot of what goes on in terms of narrative of poverty. And we have to realize that this is not, like, these narratives that we have of poverty are not natural, right? They aren't the way the world is, even though that's the way that narratives make us feel in this really deep irony, right? They're intentional. They advantage certain groups of people and they disadvantage other groups of people. And I think that intentionality is both the dark cloud that hangs over all of our heads, but it's also the silver lining, right? Because of their intentionality, there is some ability to change them over time. And we do see that narratives change slowly, but they do change over time. And so when you think about narratives of poverty, I think Mary has her finger on the most dominant one. And there's all different things that this is called, whether it's called kind of an individual drive narrative, there's kind of a meritocratic version of it, and there's a bootstraps version of it, which differ kind of in the way that we understand the beginning state as to whether we all start in the same position and then move based on our effort, or whether we start in different positions and can only advance through our effort. But the same kind of crux is in place. It's effort, it's drive, it's grit, it's gumption, it's will, it's whatever, all of these words that resonate with us because we think that that's how the world works. It's important, I think, to keep in mind that there are also other narratives about poverty that exist in the UK, and one in particular alternative that exists in the US. So in the work with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, we found, again, not as dominant, but this other, maybe slightly related, but quite different narrative around kind of a more romantic sense of poverty, that there's something simple about living in poverty, that you don't have to worry about all these modern conventions. And sometimes it's a choice that people make to live in these kind of these fictitious, nostalgic senses of, you get what I'm going. And a lot of times, in the US at least, that's associated with rural poverty in particular, right? It's associated with people who live in the middle of the country, who live outside of urban areas. In the US, there's another emerging narrative of poverty, which is a Black urban poverty story. So a very racialized version of this narrative, which demonizes certain groups of people, mischaracterizes kind of the culture of particular groups of people. I think it is also important to note that there is, although it's much more recessive, there is this narrative that we're finding, which is kind of an unfair systems narrative. Right, that there is a sense, and we can think about the fact that the systems that we are in advantage or disadvantage certain groups of people. It's a lot harder to get there. It's a lot harder to get to stories from that narrative, but it is certainly there. And then kind of from a framing perspective, a lot of this, the reason why that all matters is because we have the ability to tap into those narratives or to avoid tapping into those narratives. And which of those narratives we tap into is hugely impactful in terms of, again, how people think, how they feel, and what they are or not willing to do.
Yeah. And I think the one of the points that you mentioned there, Nat, was around the intentionality behind the narratives, that these don't just exist. That they're deployed deliberately. And I guess, Mary, that's where we started tonight about the discussion about austerity and about your book, Austerity Bites. I mean, there was very clear intention behind the framing of social security or welfare in the UK, as there has been. And I think, again, your book really draws this out about the long history of the way that we've framed poverty at different times, linked to individualism and individual success at different points, or to individual failure at other points. And the particular scapegoating of some groups, lone parents, both in the US and in the UK, being one of the key groups that have been at the sharp end of stigmatizing language. But I wanted to maybe go into that a little bit more, because a lot of the really powerful parts of your book, Mary, are around what this narrative and what this stigmatizing and shaming narrative actually means for people, and how that manifests itself in individual lives. I don't know if there was maybe something that you wanted to draw in there from the book.
I think that's, kind of where we get down to the level of stories and what they can and can't do. Like what heavy lifting can stories do if the only stories that we're told are a particular kind? Like if you're in poverty, you're a victim, or you're to be pitied, or you're shameless, as the TV show would have said. And I think, Nat's point about, the power of these things and what that actually does to an individual, but to a family, to communities, to our collective understanding of ourselves. The idea these things undermine solidarity, they undermine our concern for each other, and they do reinforce the structures that keep us apart, in my view. So I was thinking about this, the point that was being raised about the last 7 months and what this pandemic will do or what it won't do. And I think one of the things that it's really, it just sort of smacked me in the face recently was, because we have the discussion around poverty and inequality in the same breath, because they're, that's what the case is. But we talk a lot about social distancing, and it occurred to me that inequality is the original social distancing, because what happens is we are separated from each other. In that separation, it makes it harder to communicate on a human person-to-person level. It opens us up to manipulation from fear of each other, because if we don't meet people who aren't like us, it's much harder for us to accept the things that we're told about those people. If after years and years of being told that these people, i.e. people in poverty, are dangerous or a threat or sort of, moral compass, how do we push back against that if we've never had an opportunity to meet people from different backgrounds in order to understand that actually we do have more in common than actually divides us? And one of the things that interested me about the storytelling side of this It's one bridge that we can build. The way we put those stories out can vary. The kinds of stories can vary. But I sort of see it as like trying to develop like a toolbox, like everything in it will do something that will help us toward the end goal, and challenging the narrative, but not by myth busting, which doesn't work. That's what the framing stuff is really, really useful, because it's not just knocking stuff down, it's actually understanding how to do it. But also putting out into the world the stories and experiences of people who've actually been through it, and have actually lived it. Back in the day, I was doing a lot on mental health. That was one of my big areas of journalistic specialism, and it was around the time that arena began to talk about shifting stigma away from people with mental health difficulties. And I think there's a lot to be learned in that. You started to see more firsthand stories. You started to see more depictions of people who had lived with mental health difficulties going about their everyday business, right? So it's kind of like, this person sitting opposite you on the bus, maybe living with mental health difficulties, is not what you think it is. So I think that there's a way to harness that. And for people like me to bear some responsibility, frankly, to talk about our experiences. I don't know how else you start that. You start that if you don't begin with those stories.
Yeah, I think that's, I think all of us have a responsibility. All of us who are advocates, again, have a responsibility, and certainly for the Poverty Alliance, that's one of the things that we've been trying to do during Challenge Poverty Week, is to ensure that those stories are being told and that they're front and centre of our efforts to tackle poverty. Because unless they are, we know that our efforts are going to be blunted.
And it is the way they're framed. I mean, you can't, no matter what I've done, every time I end up coming back to the framing thing anyway, because even if it's not deliberately framed in a certain way, there's like an adoption of certain frames. And so this is where, say, as one vehicle for communicating certain messages, the media is like a whole collage of different things. But, there's been a fair bit of work going on around, well, what the hell do journalists do in all of this? Because if we as reporters just repeat back, for example, the language that a government minister uses, and we have a vehicle of mass communication to deliver that to the public, then, we have to self-examine and go, okay, so am I even asking the first and most important question, which is, what is this message? And why is it being used? And why is it being used in this particular way? Government minister is the bam, send off your piece. And then 50 pieces like that run, and people pick up their newspapers and they read it. And I find that side, I'd love to hear what Nat thinks about this, because I find that side of it fascinating, because it's kind of like you're co-opted as a communicator into these narratives and these frames. And even things that might seem sort of benign. So let's say the story's about tax, and you're writing about hard-working families and taxpayers' money and things like that. The taxpayers' money thing basically means middle-class people or above, who are supposedly shouldering the burden. Forget about the fact that every person who walks into a shop has to pay VAT on stuff, and they're paying tax every bloody day, and it's a regressive one at that. So I kind of think that side of it is fascinating to me, but I haven't been able to do enough around it. But I think that it's one of the lost vehicles in all of this, because it's a casual adoption of frames that doesn't have to be adopted at all if you actually stopped and thought about it for a half a second. Now, tell me what you think on this.
Matt, please,
Because I'm really interested.
Oh, I mean, I have so much to say, but I'll just start by saying it is rare. So apologies to any other journalists who are on the call right now, but it is rare to hear a journalist talk that way about framing, Mary, because the assumption that most journalists have is that, I don't frame, right? I tell the story how it is, and my job is not to persuade, my job is not to influence, my job is to be an objective, right? And you can hear the snarkiness in my tone and my air quotes there, an objective purveyor of the truth. But we know that there is no such thing as an unframed story. I mean, it does not exist. And what happens when you fall into that kind of trap of objectivity is exactly what Mary is saying. You end up repeating the dominant frames. And in repeating those dominant frames, you advance them, you reify them, you allow people to exercise those mental muscles. And so, I mean, you can tell I'm getting a little excited. Like, I think this idea of kind of questioning some of the foundations of journalistic practice from a framing perspective is incredibly important. But I've also found that those are some of the hardest professional conversations that I've ever had with journalists. And so I think that, I mean, we should all give Mary a silent standing ovation in kind of the ability to appreciate and reflect on those practices and connect journalistic practice and framing practice and narrative and cultural change in kind of those ways. So I'm totally in agreement with that. And I think that if we could have some shifts in journalistic practice kind of based on that realization, you know, you have the ability to kind of counter that narrative or to advance new ways of thinking or open up new ways of thinking.
Yeah, because I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, we'll move on to a broader point. I don't think it's even necessarily, because American journalists tend to talk more about objectivity and, you know, two sides much more than the British media establishment would. But I think this idea that you are not complicit in some way in relaying a particular kind of message is disingenuous. And when it comes to poverty, because, I mean, let's take an example, and it's, you know, one of the primary examples of putting the voices of people with lived experience out into the universe is the classic journalistic case study. And often they're sitting alongside, you know, stories about another 500,000 people in poverty, which is such an important story, but the case study will be framed around the hardship of that person, only the hardship of that person and their family, their struggles. You know, every single piece of that language to me strips a little bit of that person's dignity from them. You know, because you wouldn't start a story about, I don't know, like a government minister by saying how difficult bits of their lives are. You know, the issue is the issue. This person is speaking to you because they have something to say that matters. And it will be framed in a way that is often, at best, pitying. I mean, that's usually the most positive thing you'll get, is some pity. And my feeling is that if these things aren't being treated with dignity, if people's agency isn't at the center of it, if people's human rights aren't at the center of it, then, you know, we've lost before we've even started. And I don't think that's advocacy. You know, I really don't. I just think that's a different way of looking at something that has become routine and that really doesn't even do the job it sets out to do on its face. So why do it?
Yeah. Okay. I'd promised, I'd asked people to ask questions, and we've been having a great conversation here. I want to try and draw in some of the questions, and I guess inevitably I mean, you both talked about the impact of the pandemic and what that might mean for narratives, and there was some, I guess there's a few different questions around that about whether after the pandemic, this will depend on the shape of our economy and the kind of responses that we'll see both in the US and the UK, but are we likely to see a return to that kind of austerity language that we saw maybe 10 years ago, which has receded, you know, so that language of skivers and strivers has that very clear stigmatizing language has diminished. Are we likely to see maybe a return to that? And also, what do we make of some of the I guess more positive framing around what's been going on around the emphasis and the response that we've seen particularly at community level, of prioritization of values around compassion and kindness and so on. Do they spell opportunities, if you like, for us to start to help shift the narrative along, change that narrative?
I think Nat's point at the start on this is spot on, because this isn't just about how we're going to react, not just in the here and now and in the short term, but much further down, and the kind of the roots of what will develop are being put in the ground right now. And I think we're at a kind of, I don't know, sort of conflict stage on this, because literally everyone was all in it together at one point, but already 7 months out, it's all the political arguments around what's being done and what's not being done. And in terms of the language and the rhetoric and everything that shored up previous austerity policies, I mean, we've already seen some of that this week at the Conservative Party conference. So, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is making it clear that, the public purse isn't, it's like the magic money tree, right? That we were all told didn't exist, but it turns out it does exist if you're rich and you need a bit of a tax break, So they're already laying the groundwork for that. Now, it doesn't mean it will be the same incarnation that it was before, but they learned their lesson the last time around. They know what will work, and I wouldn't be surprised at all if the framing around this in the next sort of 12 to 18 months isn't very much about, we all have, I mean, Boris Johnson's already been doing it. We all have to, he uses bizarre language, but, that we all have to shoulder this. We're all going to have to carry something. I think a lot of those metaphors are going to be wheeled out. Whether they do the direct blaming, shaming axis of Skyver and Striver, I don't know. I'd like to think they'd learned their lesson from that. Who knows? Maybe they've brushed up a few more, even better ones for the time ahead. But I think it's no one has any kind of crystal ball at the moment. But I do think, and I sense this in the US as well. This isn't just a UK thing. Is that it could go either way. In the US, we're a few weeks away from an election that could completely decimate any hope people have, or it could reignite stuff. So I don't know, it's really early days, but I think that certainly the British government are already lining themselves up to try to justify not just more cuts, but policies that reinforce the ones that already exist.
So all the more reason for us to be really aware of the power of framing, the power of language, and to be ready for it when
to be ready. Weren't ready first time around. It just definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just to add on that with some, not that Mary wasn't specific, but just some kind of specific things that I'm watching. So I'm exactly where Mary is. I am on the fence. I am undecided about whether we're going to come out of this with some positive shifts in mindsets and culture, or whether we're just going to be further into what we were into before. So in terms of positive things that I'm looking at and seeing, I think there are, and I'll speak mainly from the US, but I think some of these things are true in the UK as well. I think there is a new focus on systems and structures and how resources shape group and individual outcomes. And in the US, that's the case with the pandemic, but also the movement for racial justice. I think you have different ways, especially in the US, that people are acknowledging the need for a strong role of government and supportive services. And I think you have a new kind of renewed focus on the interconnectedness and interdependence of society in a way that I haven't seen in the 15 years that I've been doing this work. So those are all you look at those and you kind of can get kind of excited about those, but then you turn in the other direction and you see a renewed focus on effort and blaming people for negative outcomes. You see, the health inequities that we see around the pandemic in the United States are being blamed on individual, health and lifestyle choices or deficient values of people of color. Those are the same old junk again and again and again, and even more strongly. You see this discussion on racism going back to individual acts of hatred and racism and away from the systemic ways that race and racism are kind of perpetuated in the United States. So I'm I'm with Mary on this one. I go from like minute to minute, day by day,
Yeah.
kind of switching back and forth between being optimistic about, oh my goodness, I haven't seen that in 50 years. And then I turn around and, oh my goodness, there that is. I've seen that for 15 years.
I think one of the things that is evident in both countries is this kind of, is it the sort of death throes of a particular generational outlook, as the younger generation comes through. And certainly we've seen that around racial injustice, and we've seen it particularly around climate justice, where there is, I think it'll be really interesting to see what the younger generation does and how they stand up to the sort of barrage that we have all become as an older generation accustomed to. The work I've done with the younger generation, I think, has been, for me anyway, the most sort of inspiring of everything. Because I absolutely love that they don't just automatically accept what they're told. They're not willing to be told to shut up just because they're young. The language they're using around justice is so much more inclusive, and that includes justice for trans people, it includes justice for Black and minority ethnic groups, for disabled rights. And they're framing it in a rights-based and justice-based way. And I will be intrigued to see how that moves forward, and how successful it might be at pushing back, because it feels like a different kind of pushback to the ones that we've had before. And it's not just talking fairness and compassion and things. It's really fundamental rights. And I'm quite heartened by that. But what, totally in line with what Nat's saying, what is the unknown in all of this is that there is a large amount of power held by a smallish group of people who want to hang on to that power, and that includes their money.
Yep. And there has been one question come up in the chat there that kind of goes to this question of, is there any reason for us to be optimistic that we've, some of the work that you've been doing, Mary, through Project Twist It, that I think gives us grounds for optimism, and for, like you said, the various stories of young people talking about their lives and how they can be changed, and really addressing stigma head on. And I think, Nat, the work that Frameworks Institute have done is helping us to understand how we can change the narrative more. But we've got a question saying, well, how will this, why do we think these kind of actions are going to be successful when perhaps decades of similar kinds of actions of trying to change the way that we talk about poverty, or change the way that services are delivered, haven't stopped the stigmatization and shaming of people on low incomes?
Nat, do you want to go first?
Big question.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Thanks a lot.
I
think it's a cynical, jaded, but reasonable question, and I think it's the right question. So I'll say a couple of things quickly, and then I'll give Mary a chance to answer that as well. So first of all, I think moments matter. So you look back through history, and there are these kind of moments of uncertainty, of flux, of flux, of turmoil, of chaos and ideas. So in the United States, you look at the Great Depression, or you look at 9/11, and in different ways, mindsets in the United States shifted coming out of those events. In the first one in a good way, and I would say, and then the second one, I think, in a very racist, Islamophobic, othering way. And so I think there is some reason for optimism in the current moment, given how kind of deeply and fundamentally core ideas are in tension and are in flux. And then the other way, and this is kind of, I realize this is circular in its logic, but I mean, if you never try to start doing things in a new way, you'll never get different stuff. So just saying that we've been trying this for however many years is true. But to me, that is a justification. That's a motivation to start trying to do it in different ways. And I like to think that we are getting smarter about this stuff. We are getting smarter about the connection between what we say and how people think. We're getting smarter about the kind of power of narrative and culture, and the connection of culture to policy and policy to reality. So to me, the argument or the idea that we've been trying this for a long time is actually motivating. It motivates me to want to get smarter, not saying that we didn't used to be smart, but to kind of learn about issues in new ways and try new things. Because the other option is we either give up or we just try the same old stuff that we've been trying and we get the same results. So I don't know, maybe you can have a more, a better, less snarky answer to that question, but it's a really good question. I don't mean to dismiss it at all.
I mean, I totally agree. I think that, I don't know, I mean, I think we're now in a position where we are having this discussion in multiple different ways, to the point where sometimes we don't even know we're having the discussion. But the very first point of anything is the question. And I think lots of organizations, big and small, lots of individuals, lots of people working in communities, in grassroots organizations, are all questioning some of the fundamentals. And you don't change anything unless you stare down the fundamentals and say, okay, I might have been doing this for 30 years, but you know, we did our best, and that's good and admirable. But things change, they change fast. The messages coming at us are different and more powerful. How can we adapt? How can we adjust? And I think it's encouraging that certainly from my work, I have seen more and more people doing that. I didn't see that 6, 7, 8 years ago. It felt a bit like rabbit in the headlights stuff back then. We didn't really understand what was happening. And I think there's been a lot of work that's gone on between then and now at all sorts of levels to deal with that. And I find that very encouraging. And one of the things that I picked up while I was doing my research for the book and stuff from Project Twisted was that, you know, a lot of the big cultural changes in the world come from artists, the people who resonate across the culture. It's not political messaging, but, you know, like you think of rebel songs, you think of whatever. I think all of that in the cultural stew makes a difference. And almost every single young person I spoke to used the word creativity, almost every single one of them. And it was very much of like, okay, if it doesn't work this way, let's think about it that way. And how do we not repeat the mistakes of the past? And, you know, as Nat says, and in the arc of history, you know, the big changes, they don't come overnight. When you look at the, you know, women didn't get the right to vote because one day some people went on a protest. Of course they didn't get the vote for that. There've been all kinds of work going on in the build up to that. And then it reaches its crescendo. And then suddenly it's like, oh shit, why didn't we? What do you mean? Women didn't have the vote? You know, and at the moment we see the pushback against LGBTQ rights, for instance, because that's been a relatively recent win. But it wasn't that long ago that, like, say, Democratic politicians would have been afraid to even mention the term gay marriage, right? It's just, so I think that when we're caught in a moment, and especially a moment like this, which is truly unprecedented, we can get lost sometimes in the urgency, and understandably so. But it's not isolation. It's not, you know, it's on the path to somewhere. The question is where.
And I think from both of you, that's really, we're almost out of time, and that really is a fantastic place to finish this conversation, that we are on a path to somewhere. And I think more than ever, we're trying to frame that path, and we're trying to choose that, the right path, and the way that we'll go on it is ours to choose. And I think, and not letting other people set the terms of our discussion about how we address poverty, about what poverty actually means, and about the reality and the existence of it. So I want us to finish on the idea that we're getting better and we're getting smarter at how we frame these discussions, and we're also being more creative and using better ways and better means of having the discussion. I know that from the Poverty Alliance's point of view, we've never had so much interest in ideas about how we frame our discussions about poverty. Our team who work on this are constantly busy and constantly needing to do more work. So I think we're in an optimistic moment in amongst some really difficult times, both for people who are living on low incomes, who are experiencing poverty, and for generally as a movement how we move forward. We're out of time now. I would like to thank you both so much for your contributions. I know that we didn't even touch on half the questions that were asked, and I apologise to all the participants. Hopefully we can do this kind of chat again sometime in the future, maybe address more of those questions. But for now, I'd just like to thank Nat and Mary for wonderful contributions this evening. And I would ask all of our participants to stay connected with Challenge Poverty Week. There are events not dissimilar to this one going on right throughout this week, organised by literally hundreds of organisations across Scotland. So please get involved in those. And that's the way that we'll continue to build an alternative narrative to the one that we're so unhappy with. But once again, thank you, Nat, thank you, Mary, and stay safe and take care.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.